of the Provincial Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee. I'm also the co-chair of the Toronto Regional HSJCC and the Toronto Downtown Local HSJCC.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Diaz, and I'm the other co-chair of the Provincial HSJCC, as well as the co-chair for the Northwest Centre of Responsibility, formerly known as the Northwest Regional HSJCC, and the Kenora Rainy River District Local HSJCC. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all of the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, as we gather here, there have been Aboriginal peoples who have been the stewards of this place. In particular, I acknowledge I am in Treaty 3 territory, which is the land of the traditional territory of Ojibwe and Chippewa. I acknowledge that as we gather virtually, others may be on different territory, and invite you to offer your own land acknowledgements. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historical connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions of the Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community and our province and country as a whole. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across our country. Chi miigwech, nahiwagwa, merci, thank you.
It now gives us great pleasure to welcome highly respected Métis Elder, Little Brown Bear, to provide a special opening ceremony. Welcome, Little Brown Bear. Thank you for being here to open and close our forum over the next 2 days.
Miigwech, Bojo, Bojo Ani, Nana Bojo, Tawanchi, Tessani Ungwari, Da, Makwado Dem, Yatehe, Akonehe. I'm Little Brown Bear, and I am from the Bear Clan. And I just want to say, you know, how very humbled and honored I am that I've been asked to do an opening prayer. It makes my heart sing and dance to know that I'm so blessed to be part of this today, and that we can look at ourselves as being part of a family, part of a member of a family, that we're here to support each other and to walk arm in arm on this journey together. You know, I know some days are not easy and some are very difficult. And some days we can smile and shed tears of joy, and some days not so much. However, as we come together today of one mind, we can take this moment to breathe, just take a few minutes to reflect as we continue on this healing path together. So I want to start today by asking the Creator or God, whoever that you pray to, and the ancestors and the spirit animals from each of the doorways, from the eastern doorway, from the southern doorway, from the western doorway, and from the northern doorway, to purify our minds, that we have an openness with our minds, that we may be guided in a good way, and to clear our eyes, that we may see the goodness during this time, and open our ears so that we may hear good words shared between one another, and to cleanse our hearts, that we come here with an open heart, that we may be guided by the direction of our hearts as we always beat as one heart. I want to thank all of our relations and the four-legged kind, the wingtip that takes our prayers up to the sky world, the ones that swim in the creeks and in the sea, the star people that hold us safe, and all living things that has been blessed by the Creator or God, or for whom that you pray to, that sustains all life. I want us to today to look and to open our ears and our eyes and our mind, that we listen to one another and show respect, that we may continue no matter how trying situations may become, that as a community today, we show by our actions and role modeling how to live intimately and respectfully with all people and all of creation. And that we remember as we're doing this work, that love is an action without expectations. And the building, and to continue to build a healthy relationships that starts with sending a clear communication, sending and receiving of clear messages, and that we practice compromise, and most of all, commitment from the heart by staying in our own canoes, but passing our paddles back and forth to one another, to help one another as we continue this work. From my heart, with the help of the Creator and honoring our culture and tradition ways, we bring all of our nations together on a journey walk to promote wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. Creator, God, we thank you for our ancestors providing us with the wisdom and the strength to be helpers on Mother Earth, our Earth Mother, and for the healthy foundation we continue to build for our communities and its members to help keep our children and families strong. We ask that you guide us through our sacred journeys as we remain calm and strong in the face of all that comes towards us and the need for your strength and wisdom. Creator, I ask you humbly to continue to provide us with that wisdom, that we may understand the things that continue to taunt us and the lessons that have been given so freely for us to practice harmony and balance with the medicine wheel and the people's wheel and the wheel of health. Creator, we say Chimigwich, and we ask you to walk beside us each and every day and to carry us when we need to be carried, but to gently let us walk once again, but that you never leave us side. Creator, we say Chimigwich, Pajem Nedo, Chimigwich, Chimigwich, Chimigwich. Now, thank you.
Well, Alan, thank you, Little Brown Bear, for those inspirational words. Sarah and I are both delighted to officially welcome you to the Provincial Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee's two-day Specialized Courts Forum. Before we go any further, we would like to go over a few housekeeping items to ensure the best experience for you over the course of the forum. Our friends at the HSJCC Secretariat are here today as your official hosts of the forum. Please wave hello to Candace, Tasha, Christine, and Andrew. And let me just say that without them, we couldn't do any of the work that we do. They are outstanding leaders and an extremely talented bunch. We're very fortunate. If you have any questions or require any technical assistance, please message the host directly using the chat box and they will do their very best to assist you. I am also thrilled to welcome the talented Lisa Sorsa from ThinkLink Graphic Design to our forum. Lisa will be capturing the essence of our discussions through a visual graphic recording. Please follow along as the graphics come to life over the next 2 days. Thank you for being here, Lisa. All attendees should have received a program which includes a detailed 2-day agenda, some helpful resources, and biographies for all of our speakers. I encourage you to take some time to read through the program as we have an amazing lineup of speakers and guests planned over the next 2 days. Both today and tomorrow's sessions will be recorded. The recordings, along with any PowerPoint presentation slides, will be posted to the HSJCC website following the forum. The link to the HSJCC website has been included in the program. The Secretariat will also be sure to share it in the chat box for everyone. And Tasha has posted the program in the chat box. Please note that as a general attendee, your cameras and microphones are automatically turned off. You will only be able to interact with the speakers using the general chat box and Q&A box. If you wish to enter a comment into the general chat box, please note that all attendees will be able to view it. If you have a specific question for one of the panelists, please enter it into the Q&A box, which we will see at the bottom panel of your screen. Please note that there will be dedicated time for Q&A at the end of each presentation. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible. During the health breaks on each day, we'll be launching a poll with a series of helpful questions to get to know you all better. Please note that these questions will be mainly directed at Ontario-based attendees. There will be an option to select not applicable for those out of province. In order to submit your overall response to the poll, you will need to respond to each question. Once the polls are closed, the Secretariat will share the results with everyone. As the program indicated, the Law Society of Ontario has confirmed that the participation in this forum meets the continuing professional development requirements for substantive hours for lawyers and paralegals. Please note that the HSJCC is the provider when inputting your hours. Finally, we will be sending out evaluation forms to all attendees at the end of the 2-day forum. We kindly ask that you take the time to complete these, as they're extremely helpful for our team in improving the planning and coordination of future provincial HSJCC knowledge exchange events. Thank you. Sarah?
I would now like to begin by providing some background information as how we got here. For many years, the evolution of specialized courts, also referred to as therapeutic courts, and problem-solving courts have been a key priority of the provincial HSJCC and broader network. As many of you know, the HSJCC network is an intersectorial, interministerial collaborative consisting of professionals from across the human services and justice fields who meet at tables across the province to find solutions for specialized groups of clients who are at risk of becoming criminalized. Many of our clients have complex needs, including those with mental health or addiction issues, developmental disabilities, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or acquired brain injuries. We have several local communities around the province that provide care, coordination, and direct support to clients on the front lines, as well as 14 regional committees that coordinate communication and service integration planning between health, social, and criminal justice organizations. The provincial HSJCC acts as a provincial planning body and is made up of regional HSJCC chairs, ministry, and provincial stakeholders. Members of the HSJCC network have long understood the critical role that specialized courts, specifically mental health and drug treatments, play in supporting our client populations and in reducing their criminalization. Turn it over to you, Katie. Oh, you're just on mute, Katie.
Sorry about that, thank you. The provincial HSJCC has organized this forum to highlight client experiences, promising practices, and develop a path forward for improvement. We also recognize that we cannot have these conversations without acknowledging the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the operations of these courts, as well as outcomes for the client populations they serve. We are delighted to bring so many talented and passionate professionals from across the human services and justice sectors, as well as individuals with lived experience of these courts together to focus on these issues. We would like to extend a special thank you to our ministry partners who have supported us in all of our work at the provincial HSJCC. We are very pleased that representatives from our partner ministries are here today, especially the Criminal Law Division of the Ministry of the Attorney General, who have been an integral partner in the planning of this forum.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first special guest, Mr. David Corbett, Deputy Attorney General of Ontario. David became Deputy Attorney General in August of 2020. He joined the Ontario Public Service as Deputy Minister of Labour, Training and Skills Development in August 2019. Previously, David was chair of the Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal. His focus as chair was reducing the time it took for appeals to be heard and expanding the use of digital technologies. David was also a partner at Frankston, where he practiced law from his days as an articling student until his appointment as chair. David was also a member of the Fasken Labor Employment and Human Rights Practice. As one of our ministry partners, the Deputy Attorney General and his ministry have been invaluable supporters of the HSJCC network's mandate and many accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Attorney General Corbett.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I would say that I also very much appreciated the opening remarks of Little Brown Bear, which were very inspiring. So I want to thank the HSJCC Secretariat for inviting me to speak today and for allowing our ministry to collaborate with you on this forum. During these difficult times when we're all kept apart, it is more important than ever to come together virtually to share information and knowledge. In addition to providing a venue for collaboration on these important issues, this forum offers an opportunity to recognize and respond to the real impacts this work can have on those at the front lines. Strengthening these connections across sectors is one meaningful way to support our own mental health. My office is committed to ensuring that we're doing everything we can to assist our staff. I'm heartened to see virtually that we have such a strong turnout, and I think we have almost 400 participants, and that there's a substantial number of ministry staff that are in attendance today. I know that over the next 2 days, Crowns, Defense Council, community support workers, and those with lived experience come together to learn from each other, hear about best practices, and continue to build on past work. Since their inception, specialized and therapeutic courts have provided critical alternatives to conventional prosecutions for the most vulnerable and marginalized accused in Ontario. Many of you here today have played a pivotal role in developing best practices and creating shared expertise and how Ontario's courts can best respond to mental health and addiction in the criminal justice system. These models will continue to play a key role in ensuring access to justice for Ontarians over the coming years, and I'm excited to see how they will evolve to reflect our changing realities. The Ministry of the Attorney General is building on the strategies developed through mental health and drug treatment courts to implement Ontario's first Justice Centre models. Planned centres in Toronto Downtown East, Toronto Northwest, Kenora, and London will take a transformative approach to justice by moving the criminal process into a community setting and integrating health, justice, education, employment, and other social services. The ministry is starting with 4 unique pilots tailored to the specific needs of each community and providing both virtual and in-person services to support marginalized accused people. Despite a localized approach, Ontario's 4 models share a commitment to addressing underlying criminogenic factors in high-risk communities. In particular, the province is investing in increased access to and integration of culturally relevant services aimed at justice-involved people with mental illness, problematic substance use disorders, concurrent disorders, and/or developmental and intellectual disabilities. This is just one of many innovations happening in specialized courts across the province. And I would like to thank all of you for your work to make Ontario's justice system better for our most marginalized and vulnerable communities. To end, I want to offer my congratulations to the P-HSJCC for putting together such an important forum, and to thank you all for taking the time to attend. I'm sure this will be an enriching 2 days, and you will come away with new ideas and connections on which to continue to build on our important work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Corbett, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this afternoon to address our attendees. And thank you once again to your ministry for its work and ongoing support of the HSJCC network. I would like now to give a big warm welcome to our first keynote speaker, Justice Kofi Barnes. Justice Barnes is a judge of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. He is a former judge of the Ontario Court of Justice. Justice Barnes was admitted to the Ontario Bar in 1993. Prior to his judicial career, he was a Deputy Director of the Federal Prosecution Service, Ontario Region. Justice Barnes is the founder of the Metro West Youth Community Restoration Court, the Durham Mental Health and Drug Treatment Court, and co-founder of Canada's first drug treatment court. Justice Barnes is the founding president of the Association of Justice and Treatment Professionals. He is the founding past president of the Canadian Association of Drug Treatment Court Professionals and president of the International Association of Treatment Court Professionals. We are very fortunate to have Justice Barnes here with us today, and we thank him for his assistance in the planning of the forum. Welcome, Justice Barnes. Oh. Justice Barnes, you're on mute.
There goes. I thought I was so well organized. But anyway, thank you very much for the land acknowledgement. Thank you, Little Brown Bear. Thank you, HSJCC, for the invitation. It is my pleasure to speak about therapeutic courts, specialized courts. And before I do that, I'd like to tell you a story about Roland. Roland is an airline commercial pilot. Now, one day he went out with his friends to have a few drinks. And at the end of the evening, Roland stumbled with his friends into the parking lot. They came across Robert. And Robert was a stranger, but he had a jovial conversation. And at the end of it, somehow Robert began to make fun of Roland's car. And Roland, an ordinarily well-mannered person, turned around and gave Robert a sucker punched him, resulting in injuries that required screws to mend. Roland was depressed, remorseful. His trial did not get to court for some 2 years. In the interim, he sobered up. He did a lot of charity work. He was promoted to captain. He got married, had his first child. Life was good. He was found guilty after trial and sentenced to 18 months. He lost his job. He faced financial ruin. His marriage was in jeopardy. Given the severity of the injury, deterrence was the most important thing. Now, I want to tell you of another story that I got from Saskatchewan. I got it from a judge in Saskatchewan, Judge Carl Bazin, and he tells me another story. In Carlisle, Saskatchewan, is a circuit point out of Estevan Judicial Center. Now, Judge Bazin writes that there are 3 First Nations communities that Carlisle serves. He says, in my second year as sitting as a provincial court judge, I had before me an Indigenous man who the Crown was objecting to being released on bail conditions. The accused was not new to the court system and had a long record of offenses. The accused, who had been through this process before, was not overly attentive, as he was sure he was not going to be released. His record did have numerous breaches for failing to follow orders. I thought this person really was not interested in following any orders that I might make. So I asked him, is there anyone in your life, living or dead, that you would feel that you would never break your promise to? The accused was taken aback, as he was not prepared for such a question. He thought about it for a minute and he said his grandmother, who he was close to, but had passed away. Justice Bazin said, I ordered that he could be released on conditions and that the undertaking would have his grandmother's name put into the undertaking, so that where the offender undertakes to the court, his undertaking was drafted so that it read first to his grandmother and then the court. I told this man that if he decides to breach the undertaking, he is breaking his promise to his grandmother, not me. He was surprised, and he surprised me by having no breaches. And Judge Bazin said he had done this with about 5 other Indigenous offenders, and none of them had breached. These 2 different cases are not referred to judge their outcomes. However, they are referred to illustrate the premise of that interdisciplinary perspective that forms the foundation of all specialized courts called therapeutic jurisprudence. In judging a therapeutic key, Professors Weinwick, Nick, and Wexler defined the premise of therapeutic jurisprudence. The premise is that the law is a social force that can produce therapeutic or anti-therapeutic consequences. Our contemporary understanding of human criminal behavior recognizes that in many instances, criminal behavior occurs as a result of underlying human conditions, human problems, alcoholism, substance abuse problems, mental illness, poverty, etc., etc. Specialized courts, treatment courts, problem-solving courts, they mean the same thing They are an example of therapeutic jurisprudence in action. They form that multidisciplinary collaboration between treatment and justice, in which court and treatment structures are designed to tackle the underlying root causes of criminality and dysfunction, in the hope of helping find solutions, motivating, in the hope of reconfiguring the human spirit. These collaborative processes are not new. They are in fact borrowed from indigenous and tribal justice systems. And in fact, I was surprised to know that as far back as 1899 in Chicago, these collaborative systems were used to tackle juvenile issues. The first expression of therapeutic courts that we know of, a drug treatment court in 1989 in Miami-Dade. We know of the 1997 drug treatment court in Toronto, and also the mental health court around the same time. When you look at all these courts, all these specialized courts, it becomes quite clear that collaboration, multidisciplinary collaboration, the resolution between justice and treatment is what underpins all these courts. The drug treatment courts focusing on addiction, the mental health courts, the domestic violence courts, and the community courts, and all the other specialized courts. Now, someone once asked me, what exactly is a specialized court? And I find that this poem from Tanya Corners, published in People, Places, and Things, explains what happens, explains the underpinning of that multidisciplinary partnership. It says, so what is it like, and I paraphrase, to work in a specialized court? I'm often asked, tell me what it's really like. Okay, here goes. If you really want to know, we take the undocumented, the lost, the hidden, the forgotten, the disposed, the discarded, unregistered, neglected, take the wounded, the bleeding, the scared and the sore, the lonely and the frightened, the despondent, the frozen. Okay, you have them. Okay, here goes. We treat, we process, we register, we regulate, we mitigate, we legitimate, we stand beside, we grieve, we walk, run and hold, we acknowledge, we respect, we share, we commend, we talk and talk some more. We cast spells of good fortune, we wish, we dream, we pray, we hope and hope some more. We edit and redefine. We always shine a light. We always leave the door open. And the clients, what? Do you know what they do? They do the really, really hard work. There are many different multidisciplinary models. There are many forms of multidisciplinary interventions. I have traveled to several countries. I have seen so many different approaches. There's always a friendly debate as to what approach is better. But our best approach is always determined by the target group of the program's objectives, and available resources. But through all the various programs that I have seen, all the various programs, there are a number of key components of them. They're always designed to tackle some human problem causing criminal behavior. They are very specific target populations. That multidisciplinary team is always in place. The degree of collaboration may vary, but is there to address the myriad of problems that result in criminality. And non-adversarial approach is always in place. There is always a legal and treatment assessment process in place of varying degrees. There's a treatment plan of some sort, varying from the simple to sophisticated. There are case management processes in place. There are big debates as to whether harm reduction is the way to go, whether abstinence is the way to go, or whether there's a combination of harm reduction and abstinence that works. There are big debates on the use of medication. There are usually, depending on the program, a referral to other ancillary services to assist with the holistic rehabilitation of the individual. There are incentives for participating in the program. There's ongoing interaction, again, depending on the program, with justice and treatment personnel. The central role of the judge will vary depending on the nature of the program. There are various forms of compliance mechanisms ranging from low to high degree of monitoring. There's always informal training, and there's training happening, even when people don't recognize their training. They're learning from each other. As people talk, it's interesting to observe a number of programs in which you watch them begin in the early days, and over time, you find a treatment provider speaking like the prosecutor, and the prosecutor speaking like the treatment provider, and them using terms. The cross-pollination, formal and informally, are so important. The importance of flexibility for programs is important. One of the difficulties that specialized courts are facing, particularly in urban centers, is the fact that evaluation are showing that they are not reflective of the societies in which they stay in. And the importance of having the ability to have flexibility to adjust to cultural issues, issues of gender, issues of age are very important. You will notice that there are always clear distinctions in programs between the tracks for youth and the tracks for adults. Even in programs that work concurrently, they have distinct tracks. There's a clear distinction between dealing with people with cognitive impairment versus dealing with people without cognitive impairment. Many programs have evaluation systems in place. Now, they may be anecdotal, saying, oh, we're doing great, just sharing stories, or most probably the preferred route, they are formal evaluations. For example, the cardiac drug treatment court boasting of having a recidivism rate of a very low recidivism rate amongst a population that were found to be 89% most likely to reoffend. But what is more important are also the process evaluations. For example, a process evaluation in a particular court made people understand the importance of trauma-based treatment. So it made a prosecutor understood that those big speeches he was giving in a courtroom, reprimanding persons who were going through traumatic experiences were probably not helpful. But perhaps what was more helpful was the support while still holding them accountability. He allowed programs to understand why, for some reason, certain members of society were being left out. And then some programs have aftercare processes. I recall a circumstance in which I was collecting some stories of people across the country who had succeeded and gone through various types of specialized courts. And I had received from a judge a story from a particular person, but I needed that person's consent. So I had my student call that person. It been 5 years since they'd gone through that specialized program. And she was not happy. She said, I spent all these months in this program where I received all this support. I finished and I was let go. Again, highlighting the importance of ensuring that persons have contact to aftercare processes in the community to enable them to maintain whatever processes they have achieved. Research has shown that programs that have standards, general standards that at the same time allow flexibility, tend to be more successful. We have experienced COVID, and COVID has had an impact. It has had impact on access to technology, amongst participants and practitioners alike. It has reduced the referral to programs. It has had impacts on the ability of programs to deliver. There have been things like virtual burnout. Effectiveness of treatment has been challenged. But as is the spirit of specialized courts, there have been innovation and resiliency. Some have been conducting programs outside during the warm weather. Some programs decided to be conducted audially. Some social agencies are providing assistance to assist in providing Wi-Fi. Some community visits have been stepped up. Some programs are doing grocery deliveries, phone assessments. The specialized court community, both the justice side and the treatment side, are bound with so many examples of ingenuity and creativity. Our understanding of issues such as drug addiction, illness, trauma, mental illness continue to evolve. We continue to learn. Our justice system continues to evolve. There is more reference to treatment avenues and justice and treatment partnerships in the criminal code more than they were 30 years ago. Specialized courts are part of that partnership that continues to evolve. The lessons learned from today and from these courts are helping to shape how our justice system evolves in places where justice and treatment intersect. As we evolve, it becomes important that there's a need for provincial and federal frameworks for how these justice and treatment partnerships are going to evolve. Alberta has developed something with respect to drug treatment courts. The province of British Columbia provincial court has developed a general strategy. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from Chief Justice Williams of what the provincial court of province of Nova Scotia is doing. As we evolve, the importance of also having a system in place where we could learn from each other and where we could adopt evidence-based, proven evidence-based effective practices become very important. This is not a novel idea. The Center for Court Innovation in New York does just that in New York. The Center for Justice Innovation does just that in the United Kingdom. We now come full circle to recognize that this is about human beings, it's about us. Specialized courts is about making the lives of people better. As we help others, we help ourselves. It is about the participants. It is about the resilience of the human spirit. It is about hope and redemption. Now, Jeffrey G. was an addict for 18 years, and he's a graduate of the Edmonton Drug Treatment Court program. And he sent in a story, a poem that was published in People, Places, and Things. And I'd like to end my comments today with that. It reads, it's entitled Off on Past. And it reads, lost in time, a moment still, looking onto future's will, seeing smiles, wondering why, wishing the world was kind to I. With hope fast fading, the sun's dark shading, I cried out, help, help. Here I was, the kindness felt. As times did change, new dreams within range, life-changing, taking its turn was what I deserved. Upon this world as I walk, views, morals, and values caught into the real, the here and now, leading now knowing how. No more harm, none be done. Help to those still in the run. I am not lost as I once was. Here I am, as a good man does, Under the arbor in the sun, meaning found. Love has won into the future from hard times past. Happy in life, hope at last. And with that, together with you, I look forward to hearing from Nicoletta. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Barnes, for those inspiring remarks. You are the leading innovator on therapeutic jurisprudence across Canada and a true champion of social justice. I am now very excited to introduce to you our next speaker, Nicoletta Curson. Nicoletta is a consumer survivor and a recent graduate of Toronto's Drug Treatment Court program. Upon becoming an alumnus in December of 2020, Nicoletta began volunteering with Right On, a prisoner rights organization that seeks to empower incarcerated individuals through information and knowledge sharing. Nicoletta is currently working as a consultant on a research project with the Canadian Mental Health Association, Ontario Division. Nicoletta is here today to share her story with all of you. Please join me in giving Nicoletta a warm welcome.
Welcome. I'd like to thank the Provincial Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee for inviting me here to speak with all of you. I have to start off by saying I'm a little nervous. This is my first speaking engagement, so please bear with me. Though I've been thinking about what to talk about for some time, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves change with each passing day. These stories are important because they shape how we see ourselves. Each new experience adds to it, and even a small shift in perspective transforms the past. So if I had been here yesterday, my story would have been different than the one I'll tell you today. I could tell you the facts, that I had a wonderful and loving childhood, that I got into an abusive relationship when I was a teenager, that my mother died around the same time when I was 18 of cancer, that I went to prison for trafficking drugs, that I majored in English literature and received my Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Toronto in 2012, that I became addicted to opioids during my academic studies, that I entered drug treatment court and trafficking charges in 2018, and that I've now been clean for just over a year. But I've chosen to tell you a story because without stories, we efface ourselves. And so in the spirit of ardent self-recovery and self-discovery, this is today's version of my story. There are moments in our lives where everything we ever thought we knew suddenly changes. For me, the first time that happened was when my boyfriend hit me. It wasn't the hit, but what he said and how it made me feel about myself. Of course, he apologized and promised he would never do it again, but he also made the claim that I had deserved it. I had done something wrong, he told me. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what that was, but I believed it. Nobody had ever hit me before, so I figured that I really must have done something terrible to generate such a response from another human being. I thought about it in terms of cause and effect. I did something, unbeknownst to me, which had brought about this effect. As it went on, I didn't tell anybody because I was ashamed that they too would find out I was a bad person. My peers noticed my black eyes behind my sunglasses and persistently asked me about it. I lied to them, unwilling to express my shame at being found out as a slut, a liar, a thief, a deceiver, and all the other names he screamed at me. I was 17 going on 18 when this relationship began, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I had never experienced any abuse before, and it was all new to me. He was a drug dealer. He sold weed and cocaine. I met him in high school. This new normal that I found myself in lasted for 4 long years. Then it suddenly escalated. I don't know what suddenly snapped in him, but everything, the violence, the threats to kill my family, the name calling, harassing, and stalking, all got worse. I knew that he wouldn't be able to control himself much longer and that he would kill me during one of those violent outbursts. I also knew that would mean that I might have to kill him in self-defense. It was summer, and my father was off to Croatia to shoot his newest film project. He bought us plane tickets and wanted to give me a small acting role in the movie. I was excited and really needed the break, but my boyfriend, my abuser, convinced me to stay. The situation was that he had recently been sentenced on a charge and was going to jail for 90 days. He pressured me to stay in Toronto and keep the bare bones of his business operational. Maybe this seems to present an obvious choice. I could have gotten on the plane with my father instead of staying to sell drugs for an abuser who was going to be in jail with no way to harm me. But it wasn't so easy. He wouldn't be in jail for long, and I would have to come back from Croatia where he would be waiting. I thought of the repercussions I would face, and this terrified me. So I stayed, and I didn't last long as a dealer since I got arrested before summer's end. Because I didn't take the case to trial, I was never asked how or why I ended up in those circumstances. Not that it would have mattered, since I would have been too afraid to say anything. I entered a guilty plea and was given a choice of 2 years less a day or plus a day, which meant staying in the horrifying provincial institution I had already spent 6 months in, or going to a federal prison. I chose the latter. This year on the inside saved my life in the most literal sense. It physically removed me from my abuser. Unfortunately, it also created other traumas. During that year, time cooled his temper. Upon my release, though he still harassed me, extorted me, threatened me, scared away any friends I had made, and sometimes still assaulted me, it was nothing compared to before. Then he died. He died overnight in the hospital due to an ulcer he didn't know he had. For 8 years afterward, I tried to live life normally as best as I could. I traveled, I thought about what I wanted to do with my life, so I took various acting lessons. I had a healthy, though uninteresting, relationship with a very nice guy, but I never felt quite right. The last thing my abusive ex had said to me was that he hit me because I let him, that if I had walked away the first time he did it and never come back, he would have known that I'm not the kind of person he could do that to. So still, it was my fault. Even though I had altered my life after he died and pretended and really believed at the time that all that had happened was no big deal and that I erased all that from my past, it still lingered within me. A deep sense of emptiness persisted, and I wasn't able to get rid of it. Nothing made me feel whole. So I floated through life, trying to look like everything was fine. I went to the University of Toronto and majored in English literature, minoring in Russian literature and drama. Halfway through, I got addicted to heroin. At first, it was the perfect escape. Everything still looked nice and normal on the outside, but on the inside, I wasn't there. I wasn't present in my life, and this suited me. I could finally escape my overwhelming emotions, my deep sense of remorse over my mother's death, and my self-hatred. I thought I was onto something. I had managed to trick life. I could live not on life's terms with all its sorrows, but go through everything and anything life threw at me with perfect calm, and above all, detachment. The first 2 years, I heavily romanticized my heroin use. I completed my BA with the help of this drug, I told myself. In the autumn, I went to Ryerson as an MA student. I was also offered a position as a teaching assistant, which I happily accepted. But suddenly my addiction began interfering with my workload. until it became impossible to manage both. At the end of the first semester, I had to withdraw from the program. Things started to fall apart, and still no one around me knew what was happening. I very quickly learned about the terror of withdrawal and the overwhelming constant feeling of desperation. I had run out of large amounts of money, and though I had a job, it wasn't nearly enough to support my habit. My addiction had the same elements as an abusive relationship: a devastating lack of control, of power, and of agency. I would constantly try to pinpoint when my life had changed, obsessively attempting to identify the moment when my life split in two, from the life I was supposed to have and the life I ended up with. It took me a very long time after I stopped using to discover the true nature of this question and its answers. One day, about 4 years ago, I was again arrested on trafficking charges. I had sold cocaine to an undercover officer to make a small amount of money to buy heroin. When I got out on bail the next day, everything suddenly changed drastically for the worse. I started doing fentanyl. That was all that was around. I blacked out for a month, during which time everyone in my life found out I was a drug addict. I lost my job. I ended up being evicted from my apartment. At the end of that month, I overdosed and ended up in the hospital. Rationally, this would have been the point where I realized how devastating addiction was and quit. But there is little logic in the cycle of addiction. Thanks to my wonderful lawyer, Brittany Sherwood, I was referred to Toronto's drug treatment court program. At first, I felt like I didn't belong in the program. I was addicted to fentanyl, yes, but I didn't think of myself as a typical addict. I figured that I could complete the program within the 1 year minimum without really having to do much. Show up to court twice a week, go to groups, keep in touch with the treatment social worker, and soon enough, it would all be over, and I could go back to my life. This seemed easy enough, yet in reality, recovery turned out to be much harder than I had supposed. As I fell apart, I started dating a guy who reminded me so much of my teenage abuser, though he wasn't physically violent. I did endure 2 years of emotional and psychological torment and gaslighting. During the relationship, he brought me into his criminal activities and we got arrested multiple times. Committing crimes was thrilling for him, while I found them terrifying. Every time we went out with the intention of making money to buy drugs with, I was a nervous wreck, afraid of being arrested and going to jail. Eventually, I did end up in jail for a week. This may not seem like a long time, especially because of my previous experience in the system. However, this was one of the most traumatic events in my life. This time, I was an addict and I was in withdrawal. The night of my arrest, I was brought to the hospital by 2 officers. The doctor gave me a prescription for opioid replacement therapy and a few benzos to make the night easier. However, once I was brought back to the station, everything disappeared. This week in jail, I was in a cell, sick, throwing up, then forced to clean my own vomit at each time while the guards stood watching me. When I was doing my BA, I took a class in Gothic literature. My professor defined terror as a fear of something you can believe is happening, and horror as a fear of something you can't believe is happening. There is an element of anticipatory terror to withdrawal. You know you're going to be sick, and that knowledge is terrifying and leads to desperation. I did practically everything possible to maintain my addiction because I was terrified, first of being sick, then of the unknown. I wondered how I would be able to live without the coping mechanism of addiction. But withdrawal in a jail cell is horrifying. It's no place for people who require treatment or anyone who may be able to be treated under a therapeutic model. I spent 7 days sick in that cell. The small metal sink would only dispense warm water, and I recall begging the guards for cold water as if my life depended on it. Naturally, I received no sympathy and was directed to my little sink. For an entire month after my release, I disassociated, and drugs didn't help this time. I walked around completely detached from not only the world around me, but myself as well. It was as if my body didn't exist in physical space. I remembered this experience when I went to treatment for the last time. I was at CAMH in the medical withdrawal unit, sicker than I've ever been in my life, and for an extraordinarily long time. The entire time I kept repeating to myself, this is better than jail, it's better than jail, which is where I knew I would eventually end up if something didn't change. During my time at drug treatment court, I had sought treatment 3 times. The first time I went to rehab for 3 weeks just to get that part of the program over with so I could graduate and be done with it. The second time I really wanted to quit. I stayed clean for 2 months in treatment and 2 months following treatment. When I relapsed, I told myself it was because my father was having open heart surgery paired with the simultaneous discovery of my now ex-boyfriend's betrayals and infidelities. I figured that I just couldn't take those 2 shocks and the stress of it all. So I turned to the maladaptive coping mechanism I knew best, fentanyl use. Though this was true in a superficial way, I realized later that it was because I had spent the entire 2 months after I left treatment focusing on everyone else except myself. I still didn't know who I was and what about me needed to change. After that initial relapse, I spent close to 3 months in and out of blackouts. That period of time is still hazy in my memory, but I recall that when I finally gained some semblance of consciousness, I took a good look around me. I was in a grungy hotel full of other addicts, dealers, and gangsters. I won't go into the details on account of privacy concerns for those who were around me at the time, but I felt invaded and trapped. Those are the 2 feelings I most strongly detest, feeling violated and seeing no clear way out. Perhaps it's because it reminds me of the abusive relationship I experienced, which was the first time I viscerally felt those emotions. I was never one to ask for real help. I thought I was able to figure out my own issues better than anyone else could. But in this situation, I knew my only way out was to trust the team at drug treatment court and ask them for help. I went to the medical withdrawal unit at CAMH, and it took a lot of effort just to stay. I kept thinking that it would be better to die. I had contemplated suicide for years, and the only thing that stopped me was the thought that I would be leaving my father behind. I reasoned that it would be easier for him without me, his drug-addicted daughter who had left him financially devastated. But I knew that despite all he went through with me, he would suffer nevertheless. What actually kept me in detox was the fear that if I did leave, I wouldn't go through with my suicide. It was plausible that I'd do some fentanyl, feel better, and put it off. And if that was the case, I would end up in a creepy hotel wasting away. While there, I didn't eat or drink for 2 whole weeks because as soon as anything touched my lips, I couldn't keep it down. I withered from dehydration and became so thin that even I didn't like how skinny I had become. I had daymares and nightmares, strange apocalyptic images crowded my mind. I saw this change in my appearance. I couldn't escape the hallucinations, so I told myself that this was a chance for a new life. But if I can't recover, I could still always take my life after. This reassured me because nothing was final and I still had that choice. I thought of my father often. During my last relapse, we would meet in a cafe to talk. I don't remember most of these meetings, and I'm sure I would have been embarrassed at how I couldn't even carry our coffees to the table without spilling half and claiming it's because I'm not high enough. But what I do remember is that my father believed in me most when I couldn't believe in myself. He would talk to me about how when I get better, we would travel together, and he would tell me about all the places we would go. He would talk about how I would complete my studies and brainstorm about the kind of career I could have. At this point, it's important to point out my privilege. I am incredibly lucky to have my father, and because of him, my immediate needs were taken care of. Many people do not have such privilege. I think the treatment team offers the support and is a vital factor in a person's ability to achieve their own version of success, whether it's harm reduction or abstinence-based. Joan Halifax, a Zen Buddhist writer known for her compassionate work with the terminally ill patients, once wrote, "We fear pain and its management. We fear loss of all that is precious to us, including our capacities, our possessions, our relationships, our dignity, and our life. And we fear the unknown, the annihilation of the self." I had spent my life effacing myself. I had to eventually learn to trust myself and become a priority in my own life. Telling one's story allows us and others to see ourselves not as a spectral reflection through someone else's gaze, but through the wisdom we've gathered through experience. These stories bind us to one another. Thank you for letting me share this version of my story with you today.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, for being here today and sharing your powerful story with everyone. Your experience and perspectives are critical in the improvement of specialized courts across Ontario. We look forward to hearing more from you as part of tomorrow's panel discussion. We will now take a 5-minute health break. We will see everyone back here in 5, so that's about 2:37. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I can see by the comments that many people were, I think, absolutely blown away by Nicoletta's talk. It was phenomenal, and we have tremendous gratitude for Nicoletta for you sharing your story. Thank you again. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our next two speakers, Candice Venna and Jean Hopkins, who will be providing an important overview on some of the background work that has led us to this forum. Candice currently works in the Public Policy Department at the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division as the project manager for the HSJCC Secretariat. Candice oversees the development, implementation, management, and post-implementation monitoring of HSJCC projects and works closely with the members of the network to achieve provincial HSJCC objectives. Jean is a policy analyst for the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division. Jean leads the addictions and complex care portfolio, where she focuses on substance use policy and treatment in Ontario. Jean has previously worked as a social worker in the community-based addictions and mental health sector and holds an MSc from McMaster University's Global Health Program. Welcome, Candice and Jean.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Katie. And I just want to echo your comments for all of our speakers and particularly for Nicoletta. That was such a powerful story. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Candice, and I'm project manager for the Secretariat. I'm just going to start the PowerPoint presentation here. If my fellow colleagues could just give me a thumbs up that they can see the presentation, that would be wonderful. Okay, great. So as Katie mentioned, Jean and I would like to walk you through today some of the background work that has been done, both on the provincial HSJCC's front and also with CMHA Ontario as one of our key partners. I would like to walk you through some of the work, particularly on mental health courts, and then moving to have a conversation on some of the work that's been done around specifically racialized populations and mental health court and addictions court diversion work. Jean will then lead our conversation on providing an overview of some of the work that CMHA Ontario and the HSJCC has done on drug treatment courts, and hopefully we can allow some time for questions at the end. So let's start with the mental health court project. So as many of you know, over the past decade, there's been increased attention from many of our government bodies as well as other members of our HSJCC network, really on the importance of addressing mental health issues within the court system and of course within the criminal justice system more broadly. The provincial HSJCC really identified a need for more resources to be available relating to mental health courts in Ontario. In January of 2014, the provincial HSJCC first initiated a project to really examine the presence of designated mental health courts across Ontario. And as many of you know, mental health courts are not specifically regulated in their operations without specific mandate on their existence. Due to this fact, they are operating ad hoc across the province and do not have a standardized process. So with that, the provincial table really wanted to dive in and take a look at these specialized courts. So there was two phases really to the provincial's identified priority on mental health courts. First objectives were really looking at the increased knowledge and awareness of these courts and the support services that go with them across the province. Also to build those relationships and links between the courts and between legal aid clinics and community mental health and addiction service providers. And of course, to improve access to justice for clients who have mental health and addictions issues, and really promoting that concept that we heard so much from Justice Barnes earlier today on therapeutic jurisprudence. As a follow-up to this, the provincial table really narrowed its focus in 2015 to improve our understanding of where these mental health courts really exist across the province. So they wanted to provide a comprehensive snapshot of how they're operating and really to ascertain the differences between them and some of the commonalities. In addition to this, the table really wanted to establish a network among mental health court professionals in order to, communicate better, share promising practices, with the ultimate goal of improving our quality of service to our client populations. So the provincial HSJCC first struck a project advisory committee, which was made up of many of our HSJCC network members and experts, as well as our ministry partners, to develop a key informant interview questionnaire. And this questionnaire had a number of general descriptive elements. And I've included some of those pieces here. So identifying information about a court, you know, how often and for how long the court sits, the eligibility processes and how that is determined, the pre-court processes, so who attends, its purpose and frequency, and some of the resources. So not only the designated staff, but any available technology and if the courts have funding. And then lastly, to look at diversion and how they're developed and by whom and with what rewards and sanctions. And I'll just note that when the interviews were conducted, it was identified that there was 22 courts defined as designated mental health courts across the province. However, through the key informant interviews, we found that actually it was 19 designated courts. While 3 of them had some specific mental health court supports in place, they were not operating as a designated mental health court at the time. So just looking at some key findings from those interviews, there were some key features and characteristics of mental health courts across the province. So all of the designated mental health courts had a date of initiation and had a separate space that was created to really address these needs for people with mental health issues in the criminal justice system. They also had designated days that they were operating with regular frequency. And this was really one of the key defining features of these designated courts. Most of those courts also have some sort of eligibility criteria to determine which clients will obviously be able to participate in the court's processes and programs. And most have a designated legal staff. And when we say designated, we mean either specifically trained to work in mental health courts or specifically assigned to that court. While designated mental health court support staff were always available in each one of those mental health courts. They also have a common purpose, so obviously care for the individual and in addressing their health and the root issues, easing the burden on our criminal justice system and diverting folks away from the criminal justice system by addressing those mental health issues and connecting them appropriately to community services. And mental health diversion is one of the shared elements of designated mental health courts. So while I'm sure there are several challenges that are associated with mental health courts and have emerged over time, during the time of the interviews, there were 2 main challenges that came up. And overwhelmingly, the first one is the lack of dedicated funding. So there was actually no dedicated funding for any of the courts surveyed, and they were all operating off of existing resources, as well as lack of availability of a psychiatrist as a common challenge, which relates back to the lack of dedicated resources. Following this, the provincial HSJCC hosted a provincial forum for those project participants to present on the key findings of the project, as well as to engage with other key stakeholders from the mental health and justice sectors. This was hosted in partnership with our ministry partners and the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division. As part of this forum, participants had the opportunity to meet in breakout groups to discuss a number of issues. One of the questions they were asked are, what are the noted strengths of mental health courts in Ontario? I've listed some of the common themes here that we have seen throughout the interviews as well. So consistency of having the dedicated Crown duty counsel and judge, having that flexibility in approach, collaboration among stakeholders, individualized and specialized mental health services for clients, obviously allows for more creativity in our therapeutic approaches, reduces criminalization of clients and aims to reduce recidivism, the addition of having an Aboriginal court worker and other stakeholders that will visit clients in custody, and consistency when all referrals are coming through one agency such as CMHA. Participants were also asked, what are some noted gaps and barriers that you see within mental health courts? One thing that is consistently rings true is the lack of resource consistency across all of the former LINs, inconsistencies in how the Crown policy manual is applied, and sometimes inflexible guidelines with respect to screening and diversion, a lack of consistency in how the mental health courts actually apply the law and ministry guidelines, as there's no unified training for stakeholders involved, lack of housing options for clients who require it, and long wait lists, for community mental health and other social service providers, which can tend to be impractical given court timelines to complete the program. A lack of psychiatric services, which obviously impacts when a diagnosis is required for acceptance into these courts. A lack of options for pre-charge diversion, and potentially legal professionals using mental health court inappropriately. The last and final question that the forum participants were asked is to identify some next steps for mental health courts in Ontario. So participants identified there is a need for more training and education for all stakeholders involved. And they mentioned the benefit of potentially having a community of practice, specifically for mental health court workers. Better integration between community-based services and mental health courts, expanding care and support for seniors, particularly those with dementia and Alzheimer's, adopting some best practice guidelines that can be flexible depending on particular community's needs, having that better access to psychiatric assessment and treatment services, including the follow-up care after discharge, increased funding for more pre-charge diversion, including police education, so we can actually reduce the need for mental health courts, and using more restorative justice methods more frequently, including having the client voice and surveying past participants for recommendations moving forward. So that is an overview of the mental health court project. So I'll just note that all of the reports that we are discussing today were actually included in your program under useful resources, as well as are hosted on the provincial HSJCC's website. So please do take a look if you would like more information on any of those pieces. But I'd now like to shift and talk about the work of the racialized populations and mental health and addictions community of interest. So this community of interest is made up of a number of key stakeholders who are obviously came together to look at the experiences of racialized populations who have mental health and addiction issues and to better improve outcomes for these individuals. This project was first identified by this group and some of the key stakeholders include the provincial HSJCC. Prior to 2016, this community of interest actually looked at the experiences of racialized populations in the emergency department, and then shifted their focus to look more at criminal court diversion programs and practices to see how racialized populations were being served. This involved focusing both on formal mental health diversion, as well as informal diversion practices and support services for racialized persons who have mental health and addiction issues and were involved in the criminal justice system. And the objectives of this group was really to increase the understanding of how diversion is applied and specifically how it's applied to racialized populations. We know that in general, there's been a lot of anecdotal information that racialized populations may not have or may not be accepted into mental health court diversion programs than other populations. But there really was a commitment from this group to explore that further, to see how equity is applied for racialized populations in this particular context. This group also wanted to raise awareness about the need for standardization of race-based data collection throughout the criminal justice system for issues of equity to be properly addressed through those evidence-based policies and practices. They wanted to contribute to, obviously, existing strategies to improve the overall well-being of racialized populations moving through the justice system, and also to really examine those perceptions of how we think about race in the justice system, not just from a service provider perspective, but obviously from a person with lived experience, and determine what is effectively needed to address those racial inequities. So in 2018, the COI first explored this work by conducting focus groups with both service providers and persons with lived experience. So that included individuals who may have been successful in receiving mental health court diversion, or who may have not have been successful and at some point or other interacted with any of the mental health court support services. Some of the key findings that came out of those focus groups were that most people with lived experience reported a lack of awareness. So they weren't familiar that mental health court diversion was even an option, or that they could be connected with any mental health court support services if they were not eligible for the program. Many also expressed confusion around court processes in general, and specifically around the diversion process. And both service providers and persons with lived experience agreed that race did affect how individuals are treated within the criminal justice system. And they expressed an overall distrust and loss of hope in the criminal justice system. Following the results of the focus group, the community of interest in partnership with the provincial HSJCC hosted a think tank day in January of 2019, really to, first of all, present on the findings from the focus groups, but build off of this, bringing together our representatives from our ministry partners and those folks who interact with these populations and support services. We brought together over 100 participants in person and 50 online to have these conversations. And the hope is in having those discussions, we could identify more areas and gaps in serving these populations and identify recommendations moving forward to improve experiences for racialized populations involved in the justice system. So 5 key recommendations were noted in a final report released in 2019. First and foremost, race-based data should be collected throughout the criminal justice system so that we can better facilitate access to mental health court diversion for racialized populations. There needs to be more culturally competent trauma-informed services within the justice system, including specialized training for police officers. We really noted that every member of the justice system has a role to play and should be responsible in promoting mental health court diversion, so it doesn't just fall on 1 or 2 of the players involved. Culturally specific systems navigators are needed to share information and to assist individuals who are navigating the justice system. And mental health court locations and hours of operation should be expanded across the province. And that is it for my 2 presentations today. I'm going to turn it over to Jean to talk about CMHA Ontario's scan of drug treatment courts.
Okay, great. Thank you, Candice. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. And again, thank you to Justice Barnes and to Nicoletta. I just want to echo some of the comments in the chat here, thanking you for sharing your story and your experience. So we really do appreciate that. As mentioned, my name is Jean Hopkins and I'm a policy analyst with CMHA Ontario. And I'm the lead on the substance use and addictions related work here. So today I'm just going to share a little bit about some previous work we've done related to drug treatment courts within the province, including this provincial environmental scan that we did in 2019. So I'll take some time to discuss some of the key findings there. And I'll also share some information about a new research initiative that we're currently working on related to cannabis within drug treatment courts as well. That was actually informed by some of the findings from this scan. So Candice, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll start us off by sharing a little bit more about the work that CMHA did in this area in 2019. And so around that time, we recognized that there really wasn't anything similar to the mental health courts report that came out a couple of years earlier that Candice has been speaking about. And we wanted to gain a better understanding, first and foremost, of where drug treatment courts were located in the province and what some of the differences and similarities were, as well as some of the common challenges. So we had identified that there were 14 courts across Ontario, which can be seen here, 2 of which weren't operational at the time of the scan. And we distributed surveys to these 14 courts and received responses really from a wide range of representatives. So this included staff and peer workers from organizations providing support and treatment in the community, as well as members of the courts, including judges and crowns from across the province. So further information about the location of these courts in 2019 can be seen in the 2-pager that was distributed in your agendas as well. Do keep in mind, though, that as a result of COVID, there have been some further changes and some of the courts are currently on pause. And we'll speak a little bit more about that later on. Candice, do you want to go to the next slide? just a brief note here to speak to some of the key principles of drug treatment courts. And this is as outlined by the Canadian Association of Drug Treatment Court Professionals that Justice Barnes is involved with. And of course, in the interest of time, I'm not going to speak to these principles at length. The principles are available on their website. But I did want to take a note to moment that, while we recognize that many courts in the province have dedicated programs related to substance use. So, for example, might offer diversion or might have hybrid models. For the purposes of the 2019 survey, we really wanted to look at dedicated drug treatment courts across the province that were linked to support organizations within their regions, and to gain a better understanding of these designated drug treatment courts that align with the principles that are seen here. The next slide. So the survey questions really covered a number of topics, but first and foremost, we really wanted to provide a history of the drug treatment court system, to outline some of the key principles and key objectives of drug treatment courts, and to ensure that we're providing an overview as to what this process looked like from the initial referral into the program to screening, participation throughout the program, and graduation. And while there's some variation in the process, all of the courts that we surveyed required a guilty plea. All of the courts were voluntary. And with most of the courts, there was also a 30-day probationary period where individuals can withdraw from the program as well. We wanted to get a sense of who is involved. And what we saw was that typically a drug treatment court team includes a dedicated judge, Crown attorney, defense counsel, and of course the treatment and support component as well, all working really in close collaboration with one another. We also asked about inclusion and exclusion criteria among programs, and typically all of the courts require that the offense be linked to a person's problematic substance use. And typically individuals with violent charges were unable to participate in the program. Requirements throughout the program vary as well, but making regular drug treatment court appearances to update the court on their progress, taking part in drug testing, and attending treatment are seen among the courts. And in terms of graduation and program completion, typically this takes about 12 to 18 months. And again, the criteria to graduate looks different court to court, but typically clients must follow specific conditions, remain abstinent from some or all substances for a certain period of time. And again, there's some variation there. And in most cases be engaged either in education or volunteer placements, depending on what the person's identified goals were. And I'll pause here too to say that one of the comments that we heard frequently from survey respondents was the recognition that drug treatment courts can be really intensive and programming can be demanding. And while the completion or graduation rates are relatively low, across the board, we heard that many clients stay involved in the program and continue to maintain relationships with supports in some capacity, even if they don't necessarily meet the requirements to graduate from the program. So in many cases, survey respondents noted that they see a real improvement in quality of life and connection to supports, regardless of program completion. The next slide. One area where we did notice quite a bit of difference among the courts was with incentives and sanctions. And so incentives were usually provided from the court in order to reward or to celebrate progress. And in some cases, sanctions were applied if program requirements weren't being met. So for example, for lateness or non-attendance. And in some cases, sanctions were also applied if a urine screen was positive for a substance. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but it does show a few examples of some of the sanctions and incentives that were named from the survey responses. And I'll also note here too that there were some courts that chose not to use sanctions at all. So instead of taking an approach, instead choosing to take an approach where they would engage with participants around what's going on in their lives, and if they're unable to meet requirements, why that might be the case. So really encouraging a culture of honesty by encouraging people to share with their supports what's going on about within their recovery and their treatment, and to be honest about slips or relapses and what types of challenges they might be experiencing. Next slide, please. So in addition to those operational challenges, those operational aspects, we also wanted to gain a better understanding of some of the common challenges, right? And so some of the key themes that were identified were unsurprisingly quite similar to the mental health court project challenges that were identified in Candace's presentation. But in particular, we saw key challenges being lack of reliable funding for programming. So only 2 drug treatment courts in the province receive any federal funding from Canada's Drug Treatment Court Funding Program. And many courts noted that they had really tight operational budgets and limited resources. Another challenge that was noted was the differing beliefs around clinical best practices for substance use treatment. So historically, drug treatment courts have functioned using a model that requires abstaining from substances. But we did see within the 2019 survey that there was some complexity in that, and that some people are supported through more of a harm reduction approach. So one of the challenges that was noted was navigating these differing approaches and some of the tensions that can arise around different perceptions of best practices within treatment. And I know Justice Barnes spoke to some of that earlier as well with his presentation. Staffing challenges were also identified, so frequent changes in partners or in court staff in particular, noting that this can create inconsistencies and can pose challenges in building relationships. As well as logistical challenges. So for example, finding available and consistent space for court, access to regular urine screens, client access to transportation were also named as well. And among the difficulties in accessing support services, one of the most significant challenges that was noted was a lack of housing options. And we saw this reflected across the province and in nearly every survey response. So this was a real issue. And again, that was reflected in the mental health court's report as well. In addition to that, there are additional challenges in accessing community supports for specific populations. So in particular, LGBTQ+ participants, Indigenous populations, and support services for participants with dual diagnosis. So ABIs and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in particular. Another challenge that was also identified here was the approach to the use of psychoactive substances within the program, in particular if they are prescribed. So for example, how to navigate prescription benzodiazepines within the program, or questions around what best practices might look like and what the approach should be to both medical and recreational cannabis were considerations that came up a number of times among survey respondents. And of course, more recently, COVID-19, of course, and the changes and the challenges that we're going to be discussing over the next 2 days, and discussing some of the innovation and the resiliency that Justice Barnes mentioned earlier as well. So just wrapping up here, I did want to speak to some of our future work. Candace, if you wanted to go to the next slide there. Thank you. And while this scan hasn't been officially released yet, we are in partnership with the provincial HSJCC planning on doing so. And we're hoping to capture some of the current operational challenges as a result of COVID and how that's impacted both the courts, but also the support services and how services have managed to adapt and be creative in service provision. And of course, you know, this forum is a really important component of that as well. So at this time, we're currently in the process of connecting with those identified courts in the province to get some updated information and see how their operation has been impacted as a result of COVID. So we're really looking forward to the discussions that we're going to be having around this at the sessions tomorrow and hearing more. In addition to this, we're also in the process of a new research initiative in this area as well. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, when we did this scan in 2019, questions around cannabis use was a common theme that emerged throughout the survey responses. And this may have been because it was shortly after cannabis legalization, so it might have been top of mind. But we know that there isn't a consensus or a unified approach on how courts in the province respond to cannabis consumption among participants. So there's differing approaches there. And last year, our team applied to the Mental Health Commission of Canada's community-based research grant with the intention of exploring this further and the role of cannabis within drug treatment courts, and developing a research project that will look at how cannabis use impacts the mental health of people who are going through the drug treatment court process in Ontario, and how that might impact participation. And so this research is being done with a team from the Canadian Mental Health Association, the John Howard Society of Ontario, the provincial HSJCC, people who have lived experience of the justice system, and Dr. Akwasiu Supempa from the University of Toronto. So you can see that it really builds on some of the pre-existing work that we did with this initial scan, and we're in the initial stages of that research. So for those of you that are involved in drug treatment courts, you might be hearing from our team soon, and I welcome any questions or any further insights that you might have, and please feel free to contact me at the email here. But Candace, I think I'll pass it back over to you, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Jean. I see we have 1 minute before our break, but I know that there's a number of Q&A that came through during the presentation. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, Christine, if perhaps you can read some of those at least over the next 2 minutes, and we can try to address the rest by typing in our answers afterwards.
Sure, that sounds great. The first question is about training. What does the training look like for those assigned to mental health courts? And was that part of the review? And maybe we could expand that to any of these studies.
I don't think that was part of the review. I think the training they were saying is sometimes offered for those that are working in those courts. I don't think it's a requirement, unless another one of my panelists would like to respond on that matter. But it wasn't included in this work, just noted that designated means they are working in those courts and may have special training for mental health issues.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't inquire about training for the drug treatment court scan. I think that's an excellent question. And I wonder if maybe that's a question that we might be able to talk about with some of the panelists at the sessions tomorrow. But unfortunately, that's not something that we inquired about with our scan.
Thanks, both of you. Another question here is just asking for clarification. Is it possible to elaborate on what was meant by the concern that legal professionals might be resorting to mental health courts inappropriately? Can examples be provided?
Yeah, those comments came from the forum within the report. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up to that, but I'm thinking it has something to do with some individuals being referred as a means of diverting them, but not necessarily getting at the root issues of why that individual, like what services that they need, and being inappropriately referred to mental health court as opposed to getting another support services and going maybe the traditional means. Christine, I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that as well, but that's all that was provided within the court's report.
Yeah, yes, I also assisted with that report, and yeah, I think the feeling there is sometimes people might have done perhaps better in drug treatment court versus mental health court, or some other kind of therapeutic support. On that note, maybe we can fit this last one. Justice Barnes noted that one of the aspects to consider is the person's cognitive abilities. Do you feel this is a consideration within the mental health and addictions courts in Ontario? That is, do they allow for enough individualized programming when someone doesn't fit the standard procedures?
Perhaps that's a question for one of our panelists today, and something that we can address tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that, when I reflect on some of the survey responses, certainly looking, as I mentioned, at dual diagnosis and the lack of individualized supports for acquired brain injury or FASD, for example, were mentioned pretty consistently in survey responses. But again, I think that, yeah, someone who's working directly with those courts might have some further insight into that question for sure.
That's great, thank you. And maybe lastly, some questions around youth. Were any data gathered from youth mental health courts? And someone else stated that youth diversion programs have seen a significantly low number of referrals. Could that be related to COVID-19?
So note this was for adult mental health courts only across the province. And I can't really speak to the second question around COVID-19. Again, I would want someone who's working more directly in youth mental health courts to respond to this, unless any of my colleagues have any thoughts.
I don't, I'm sorry.
I think youth might sometimes be included in Indigenous people's courts or Gladue courts, for example, but that's not something that we've specifically looked at. A question here, what is the ETA for releasing the study? And I think that came through, Jean, while you were speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And again, we're in the process of connecting with some of those courts to get some further updates on, again, how their operations have shifted and changed as a result of COVID. Unsure. I don't want to put a date forward, but soon. And please do feel free to email me with any questions that you might have or any suggestions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and same here. I'll type my email into the chat box for everyone for whose questions we weren't able to get to today, and happy to connect with you further.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll see if we can respond to some of these as well virtually. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, a big thank you to both Candice and Jean for your presentations. This has been extremely helpful in laying the foundation for our discussion over the next 2 days. I am thrilled to introduce to you our first keynote judges panel, focusing on best practices in specialized courts. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists here today, all from various regions of the province who work in both mental health and drug treatment courts. First, I would like to welcome back Justice Barnes, who will be the moderator for this panel. Joining him are Justice Perkins McVeigh, Justice Lisa Cameron, and special guest, Chief Judge Pamela Williams from Nova Scotia. Welcome, judges, and thank you for taking the time to be here for these important discussions.
All right. I think I should put on my video. Yes. Now, I cannot see my panelists on my screen, but so that I can gauge the, okay, there we are. Yes, yes. Good afternoon, and we are looking forward to our conversation. What we expect is going to be a good conversation. And before I will start with the first question, we might as well just get into it. So Chief Judge Williams, why don't you tell us something about yourself and your jurisdiction? Yes, so you start us off.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be invited to be on to conference on specialized courts. So I've been a judge for 17 years. Before that, I worked 20 years with Legal Aid, dealt a lot with vulnerable and marginalized people, including people who feared with youth. We have had a wellness court since 2009 that's been funded about 75% by the government. Initially, it was only a mental health court, gone through some iterations, and now the umbrella court is the wellness court, and underneath it are two programs. So there's the mental health court program, there's the opioid drug program, and there's the alcohol court. We sit weekly on Thursdays. We have our pre-meetings in the morning and court sessions in the afternoon. And we serve as an area of about 550,000 people. We have a dedicated team, judge, crown defense. We've got 3 clinicians. One is a forensic nurse. Second is a social worker. The third is an occupational therapist. charges and FDA disclosure.
Chief Judge, I should let you know, your audio is a bit, it's a little difficult with the audio.
Better?
Yeah, say something again.
Hello? Hello?
Okay, we'll see how it goes when we get back to you, but it's better. So Justice Perkins McVeigh.
Yes, thank you for inviting us to be on this panel. I have been involved in the drug treatment court and the mental health courts in Ottawa since before I was appointed to the bench. I was involved in starting with a group of others, the adult mental health court, the youth mental health court, and then became involved as in the drug treatment court as a judge. So I also sit in the Indigenous Peoples Court. So I'm actually in the very, very privileged position to be able to give some observations about all of these courts. All of the courts have the Crown as the gatekeeper, and all of them very much embrace a multidisciplinary approach. Each of the courts operates differently, but for example, our mental health court, we have one main service provider, which is CMHA, but we have 27 other partners who all work together to help come up with an appropriate case management plan for each individual person who's in mental health court. Our mental health court is not a diversion court. We have 3 types of persons in our mental health court. I like to call it a bit like an Oreo cookie. We have those that are have level 1 or lower level offenses, and those persons are certainly eligible for diversion, or once they've gone through the case management plan set for them, charges will be stayed, withdrawn, or perhaps a Section 810. The second level is those that are facing more serious charges. They too are eligible to participate in the program. It may be that their involvement is to engage with some rehabilitative services or to engage in Mental Health Act assessments so that persons then can be eligible to be sentenced to St. Lawrence Valley Treatment Center or engage in other, perhaps even a conditional jail sentence. Those are not persons eligible for diversion. And then the last group, this court also deals with persons that are NCR and dealing with fitness issues. So the Crown is the gatekeeper. We have many partners, and it's a very individualized plan of care. So it's not as structured, and perhaps it's a little bit too treatment oriented, but that's how our mental health court has worked, and it's worked very effectively. Drug treatment court follows the more structured drug treatment court model with involvement of the addiction services from Rito Wood. We also have a group of partners that assist participants in working on vocation, education upgrading, business planning, that kind of thing. The primary treatment provider is Rito Wood for addiction. It's a 3-phase program. The first phase is the 30 days of assessment. The second phase is a formal admission into the program. And after the 30 days, the person's guilty plea is locked in, and they're sort of locked into the program. During the first 30 phase, this assessment phase, it's sort of a meet and greet, see if people are suitable for the program, whether or not they can work with treatment, whether or not they can work with the rules of the court. So the second phase, or that once they're formally admitted, is the intensive treatment portion. And so that's a predominant phase. And then the last phase is where persons start working with Rito Wood and some of our other partners in either doing education upgrading or finding employment or doing volunteer work, or any or all in combination thereof. And we too, I was interested to see the slide about the sanctions and the rewards. We have coffee cards. They're not worth very much, but they're actually worth a lot to our participants, which is great. So if somebody has a clean screen, they're eligible for a coffee card, and otherwise it's praise and encouragement. we also have early leave. So if you've been 60 days minimum in the program, 30 days clean, then you get to leave early, which now in COVID is an early hang up on the phone. But in the olden days back in court, they would get to leave early. It wouldn't have to sit around and hear about what the rest of the participants are doing. And we don't have any money for like gifts and big prizes. So our next reward is for somebody who's been clean for 60 days and has been, 60 days consecutive on early leave. They get to be called an all-star, and they get to be their name on the board. And although it's an attaboy, and some of us might not see that that's particularly valuable, to see your name there moving up the ladder actually seems to have some real relevance to our participants. And then last is All-Star Elite. And those persons have to have been 30 days consecutive as an all-star. We have 3 levels of graduation. No matter which level of graduation you're in, it's guaranteed a non-custodial disposition. Only level 1 graduates who have been in the program for a minimum of 9 months with no new charges and 6 months compliance with all expectations, no sanctionable behavior, continued abstinence for level 1 is 6 months prior to graduation. They get a suspended sentence, 1-day probation, and the ancillary orders. There is aftercare that's offered for those persons, mandatory aftercare. It's usually 4 to 6 sessions. Level 2 graduates, similar, have to have stable housing, compliance with expectations, but their level of abstinence is not less than 3 months prior to graduation. And for those persons who are struggling, that are doing their damnedest, they're really trying to follow all the rules, but just can't seem to get that clean time. If treatment feels that it's perhaps better for their well-being to come out from under the cloak of the criminal justice system, and perhaps they've been in the program more than a year, then they can apply for a level 3 graduation. It's rare, and those persons generally have probation attached for up to 24 months. But generally that's our program. All types of offenses are eligible. We don't allow persons with significant records of violence in the preceding short period of time. We don't allow persons with domestic violence charges or residential break and enters, certainly commercial break and enters. And recently, we've taken some chances on some persons whose records were perhaps of concern. A lot of those persons have been our STAR graduates. So sometimes taking risks is a good thing. So that, in a very condensed nutshell, is our mental health and our drug treatment program. Our youth mental health program is modeled on the adult program, of course, with all of the attenuant changes to accommodate Youth Criminal Justice Act. It only sits once a month, and we don't have a lot of persons in our youth mental health court, but it appears that there's fewer youthful offenders in the system at the moment, and certainly fewer in our youth jails. So yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Justice Cameron, how about you?
Okay, so really quickly, I've been in the criminal justice system about 35 years. I just retired. I've worked both Crown and Defense, as well as duty counsel. I've been involved with community courts for about 20 years. Before I was on the bench, I was involved quite a bit with the HSJCC at the local, regional, and provincial level for about 7 years. My home court, which is in Lindsay, that's a community of about 20,000. It's primarily agricultural, rural. I also sit in 5 other courts in our jurisdiction. There's a satellite court of about 6,000 people, and an urban court in Peterborough about 84,000. So those all have what we call community court. And We pretty much take all comers. It's mental health and drug addictions, and we don't, to my knowledge, although it's the Crown that gives the final sign off on who joins our court, they're pretty open-minded about the person's history and their charges. We have quite a variety that are admitted into community court, and referrals can come from anywhere. Lawyers, community workers, the person themselves, anybody. So we have never had any funding, except occasionally a little bit of money through the P-HSJCC to support different programs. For example, transportation is often an issue for our folks. So there was a program to help people with bus fare or cab fare or whatever for traveling to appointments or to court. We do have justice service workers, like mental health court workers, normally headed up by CMHA. And it's the JSWs that coordinate all the activities and organizations in the community that are supporting the individual accused person. Mostly we have dedicated Crowns, duty counsel, and court staff. It doesn't always happen, but mostly. Once a person's been approved for community court, there is a plan of activities that's created and it's filed with the court. Very roughly speaking, we have two streams, a diversion stream and a not diversion stream. And the end result on that court supports stream varies quite a bit, although tends to mean no jail at the end of the process. People come either once a month or twice a month to court for updates. We encourage the individual, the person themselves, to provide the court with that update with some help from their workers. And that's a really good way of fostering communication with that person. We don't have, in the Lindsay Community Court, no sanctions or rewards per se, but they do in the Peterborough Court. They both have steering committees. They both have versions of multidisciplinary teams, which meet just prior to each court appearance to review each case to streamline the process once you're in the courtroom. And I would say, generally speaking, Peterborough has a more formalized, structured process, whereas the one in Lindsay is more towards the organic end of the spectrum. So, and the judges are dedicated as well. We tend to preside in community court for 1 to 2 year stretches. It might be just one judge or two judges that might trade off depending on other assignments or vacation time, that type of thing. So that's us.
Right. So that's you. You know, one of the questions, common questions that we hear is this debate as to, you know, there's some programs that require guilty pleas, others don't require guilty pleas. You know, Justice Heather McVeigh, Perkins McVeigh, what do you think about that? I mean, do you have any view on that issue, the guilty versus no guilty plea issue?
Well, I'm not sure there's a right answer, and I think that every court is somewhat different. I have wrestled with this for periods of time. I guess my thinking is in mental health court, particularly if it's a diversion focus, that where the mental illness has played a significant role is the absence of mens rea and the commission of the offense, but short of NCR or not worth, the charges aren't worth pursuing an NCR. I don't think there should be a guilty plea. I think if it's going to be diverted, then that shouldn't be a requirement. On the other hand, in something like drug treatment court, where we're actually looking at pretty serious charges, most of the participants, often it's hand-to-hand trafficking or trafficking as long as it's not commercial. I'd say a predominant number of cases are trafficking. We also have quite a few commercial break and enters, the serial thefts, where somebody's looking at a significant jail sentence. Nobody's going to commit to drug treatment court for a 9-month period or more if they're not facing a serious jail sentence. We do have persons who, with their criminal records, the jail sentences they're facing are potentially in the penitentiary. So in those circumstances, a guilty plea is, I think, required and very appropriate. It's in the mental health court field that I feel less comfortable about requiring a guilty plea. And in IPC, similarly, there's a lot of diversion. IPC is Indigenous Persons Court. And I think there is no right answer, and a lot depends on the nature of the charge. I'd be curious what other people think.
Yeah. Does somebody have a view? Anybody dying to comment on this?
I could just indicate quickly that we have the same issues as Justice Perkins McVeigh has identified. And sometimes for people who are in the, we'll just roughly say, less serious diversion stream, you can have people acknowledge accountability or responsibility for the event without pleading guilty. They can acknowledge being there, participating, being responsible for something that happened. Maybe it's part of the allegations, not all of them, without it being a guilty plea. And I think that that acknowledgement, whatever form it takes, plea or not, is an important step in the process. It just has to be fine-tuned to the particular case and the particular person. And I think if there is going to be a plea or acknowledgement of some kind, it's best done early on in the process, because you know, I had, wasn't just me, but a group of us in dealing with an individual had a very bad experience that was a strong lesson for me when early on in one of the courts, the plea somehow got overlooked. It didn't happen until the end of the process, and it had a devastating impact on this individual who had come so far. And then at that stage, having to revisit the plea and hearing the facts, it was not helpful at all. So if there is going to be some kind of plea or acknowledgement, I would recommend that it's early on in the process.
All right. Okay. You know, Justice Cameron talked about a community court and about the fact that there are different streams. And that's the way community courts are structured. There are different streams. But there's been some discussion as to whether or not it is a best practice to keep everything separate, whether you should keep drug treatment court separate from mental health court, domestic, keep it all separate. Justice Perkins McVeigh, what do you think about that?
Well, I can tell you my thinking has evolved over the last 10 years on this point. I used to feel fairly strongly at the outset that they should all be separate. I recognize that there's an awful lot of overlap in terms of the profile of the participants, that many of the persons in drug treatment court have underlying mental health issues or vice versa, and that many of the persons in our mental health court have drug treatment and concurrent disorders, and the same as in our Indigenous Persons Court. And so you think about that and you say intuitively, maybe it's okay if they're all merged together. But that wasn't my thinking at the outset. My thinking at the outset was that for people in mental health court, the predominant feature should be the treatment of the mental illness. And I will be the first one to admit that I don't think I am correct in that. And it's very interesting because the foundation of most mental health courts is treating the illness. And when I look at our courts across Ontario, that's still the predominant feature of mental health court. But there's been some really interesting studies, and I wrote a paper, it's a little bit out of date now, but that was 2015. And I did a little bit of a worldly international checkup about some of the evaluations of courts. And the fascinating thing that struck me is that these were UK courts, US courts, Australian courts, is that treatment in mental health court was not the key indicator that would prevent recidivism or relapse. And similarly, what they found is that treating allows persons to participate in other programs, but really and truly, what made a difference in keeping people out of jail and keeping them out of hospital was providing all those things that we all know who are in the system. The fact of having stable housing, having access to employment, however it is, whatever form it is, having access to appropriate community-based recreational programs. They call them the 8R and R, and that risk recovery model. And those are the things that seem to make a difference. The other thing that made a difference in the studies that I read shocked me. And that is the judge makes a difference. I don't know how many of you have looked at the 311 Jarvis evaluation of the youth court at 311 Jarvis in Toronto. But one of the predominant things that came out of that study, and not very many courts in Canada have really undergone rigorous evaluation, but in that study, the judge was found to make a difference, both to the parents and to the participant, that interaction and that connection and that accountability to one judge made a difference. And in all of these international studies, they similarly found that the judge made a difference, that a program that allowed persons to be given stable housing, given access to the, as I said, recreation, employment, education, upgrading, that made the difference. Yes, in mental health court, the treatment allowed them to better participate in all those things, but that wasn't key. And when I think about our drug treatment model, I think the thing that makes it work is that you make someone whole again in many ways by allowing them to embark on a new life. So all that to be said, I don't know what the right answer is, Kofi. I think every jurisdiction has their own needs. And as Justice Cameron was talking about, one community court's quite structured, the other community court is, quote, loosey-goosey or more go with the flow. And I think every jurisdiction has to find what works for them based on the resources they have available to them. And just to add to it, my concern about keeping people in mental health court for long periods of time, like we do drug treatment court, is that to me, it criminalizes mental illness. It adds to the stigma. I don't like to think that persons should be in the criminal justice system any longer than they absolutely need to. And so I'm not as keen on keeping people with mental illness in a long-term structured program, and yet all these international studies say that's what works. So I'd love to hear everyone else's ideas. I'm doing some more research on this area because it's something that I think is important in terms of determining what are the best practices in our courts. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts.
All right. Lisa, any comment on this?
Oh.
Okay, Chief Justice, you're muted. Yeah. Okay. I
no, we can't hear you.
Do not know why.
Welcome to 2021.
Okay. All right. So Chief Justice is fixing the problem that Justice Cameron, do you have any comment on this, or should I just
I would just say that I think a lot of whether it's separate courts or together is driven by what's on the ground where the courthouse is, the size of the community, the resources available. Because as Justice Perkins McVeigh said, that the people have so many common needs that aren't so much to do with, do I need help with a mental health issue or an addiction issue, which almost inevitably overlap anyway. It's all the other stuff that is also common, that it kind of makes sense to have those same issues with those same workers all in the same place. But it depends a lot on what's available in your community.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm more or less saying that you're more or less saying that don't get hung up on these distinctions. Try and figure out what works in your jurisdiction. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it?
Able to hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay, good. So I agree with Justice Perkins McVeigh that really the social determinants of health really need that holistic approach of how you deal with the person. So rarely does someone come with just a mental illness without vulnerabilities, marginalization, lack of housing, unemployment. Often, you know, we found in our drug treatment courts, the presenting problem for a lot of the guys is an opiate addiction. But once you get it stabilized, you realize there's a lot of trauma underneath it and sexual abuse, children, and they've just internalized it all. And so you find, oh my goodness, we're in a drug treatment court, but my God, we need services to help address the mental health issues. And so that was one of the reasons why we decided to have one umbrella court, but the 3 programs, and to fit people within them and have the expertise, whether it be our social worker who deals, you know, with the drug folks, or our forensic nurse who deals more with the expertise around the mental health issues, or our OT who may be required to help any of these various people in finding education, employment, or whatnot. So really it is a holistic sort of looking at the social determinants of health. And again, it does depend on your location. You know, some small areas just do not have the resources to have independent separate courts. And so having a wellness court or having a community court is likely the way to go, and to be able to assist the larger number of people that are presenting.
So what we found is, what we found is that I have to say in Ottawa, we're blessed with the luxury of riches to have the ability and the resources to have those 3 courts that we do. Or we also have a domestic violence court, but I'm not going to get into that. But one of the things we've noticed is, of course, we sometimes have someone that starts out in drug treatment court, and the manifestation or the outward manifestation of their mental illness is such that they really are a better fit in the mental health court. We do access mental health services for persons in drug treatment court, because as Justice Williams said, absolutely. Once the fog clears, so to speak, it's living with the trauma, what led them to the abuse to begin with, that needs to be addressed. And certainly we are so lucky to have the ability to refer people to mental health services when they're in drug treatment court. And we have the ability to refer people in mental health court to drug treatment services. But I think you're right. It's whatever works in your jurisdiction. And I think it's better to have a wellness court or a community court and provide some of these supports to persons than no court at all.
Yes. And so operational best practices, right? People are setting up their courts, doing all kinds of things. Some courts are making things better. Some courts are actually making things worse. It's like a car. It looks like you gotta know how to drive it and how to maintain it, right? So Chief Justice, what are some of the best practices, operational best practices you would like to tell us about?
Well, first of all, you know, funding is a huge issue for many of these programs. So I would say don't allow that to prevent you from getting started. So just get started, build it, and build it with a framework that is somewhat flexible and malleable, because you will need to evaluate it, reassess it, tweak it, and make changes. And so, you know, in the beginning, we were the Nova Scotia Mental Health Court. Problem with the name, we were only in Halifax. And so people would say, well, if it's a Nova Scotia Mental Health Court, then why can't people all across the province have access to it? So eventually we changed the name to the Dartmouth Wellness Court. Originally, it was just for mental health folks. And we learned early on, oh my God, most of these folks have concurrent disorders, but yet we don't even have an addictions worker with us. So we had to rethink that whole piece. In terms of eligibility, you know, you create your eligibility and you learn lots of lessons of what you forgot to include, because you can't think of everything in the beginning. And so you just need to be able to reevaluate. There's that whole piece of what we call the nexus For us, there needs to be a connection between the offending behavior and either the mental illness or the drug addiction. And sometimes that's really difficult to determine, especially when, let's say someone has trauma, turn to substances and commit a crime. So the crime is because they're high, but really they're high because it's a long history of trauma. So sometimes it's really difficult teasing out that nexus, but I think it's really important. You know, you've got to have, our criteria includes a major mental health disorder. They've got to either acknowledge responsibility or enter a guilty plea. And going back to the conversation we had a while back when my microphone wouldn't work, normally there's an acknowledgement of responsibility in the mental health court. However, if motivation is a question or somebody's got a lengthy record, we may require that guilty plea up front just to show that they are serious with their participation in the program. And at the end of it, we may withdraw that guilty plea. And there are others where a guilty plea, because of the serious nature of the charge, will need to be maintained throughout with a non-custodial at the end. But it's that flexibility. You know, we learned as well after our 5-year evaluation that it's really important for that needs assessment to be completed, because that need assessment assistant will look at the person's needs, their risk, and how we should respond to it. Because we don't want to underservice those who need services, and we don't want to overservice people, because we're told that too can hamper their rehabilitation. And, you know, within the last couple of years, we've also added 2 additional criteria. And the first is, are they ready? This is an opportunity. One of our legal aid lawyer in the program says, we're in the business of providing opportunity. And it's up to the participant what they do with it. Some folks just aren't ready. They want to, but they're just not ready. So we assess readiness. And the other is, can we manage the risk? Unlike some other programs, we don't differentiate. You know, we've had 3, I think, over the course of 11 years where people were admitted on attempt murder charges, aggravated assaults, robberies, serious violence. But in every case, we assess whether we can manage the risk in the community, because ultimately it's the integrity of the community that is at stake. And we have to be able to satisfy ourselves that we can manage that risk. So I think those are important components for you know, you need to have a clear framework of policies and procedures, but you need to be revisiting them all the time to determine whether they can be tweaked. And the other thing I would say is it's good to have general policies and rules. There's always an exception. Don't box yourself in so much that you cannot allow for a really, really, really deserving case to be admitted into your program because of some policy that you have that prevents it. Those are some of my thoughts.
You know, Justice Perkins McVeigh said she had done some research, and the research actually is in tune with what many of us have seen of the importance of the judge in these specialized courts. And it's not to indicate that nobody else is important. It feels funny being judges saying that. No, everybody else is exceptionally important. The research just says what it says, right? Okay. And so Justice Cameron, we know that as much as a judge can be important, a judge can also kill a program. Let's know that. With the same force that judges can help a program, they can kill a program. So what are some of the, what kind of advice would you give a judge who is not going to walk into a specialized court for the first time?
Okay, so the first thing I would recommend is what we've talked about already, is talk to someone, hopefully one of your judicial colleagues who's been in that court, who knows how that particular court runs. So you have just a brief outline of the usual process, what to expect. Next is to mentally prepare, because Community court, whatever version it might be, is a very different place from conventional court. And as was mentioned, it's all about providing opportunities. And it is for judges a little bit of a leap of faith, because we are going from a place of fairly significant control over the process, in my view, to a place of much less control. It's a very different role for the judge because it is such a collaborative process. I think it's quite important for judges to somehow find a balance between being the guardian of the court process. Although you're in a therapeutic court that looks and sounds quite different, you are the guardian of the court process. You need to keep that in mind for yourself and everyone, and maintain the court record. But you're also something of a coach. You know, not to be too flip about it, but it's a little bit court by committee, because there are so many people involved, and the input from those other people, the accused person, their support workers, psychiatrists, counselors, all kinds of people, that has significant value. And it is to a large extent a group process in each step along the way, and also in the end result. So it's really important to feel comfortable with the idea of trusting the other professionals that are working with you in that court, and get used to having less control. And as a judge, you are far more involved in sort of the pre-sentence or pre-end result process than you would normally be. A lot of what happens in community court, you would never see in a conventional court process. It would be all taking place behind the scenes. So it's quite different, and people see the judge differently. And as has already been mentioned, not because I or other judges in community court think we're so great at it, but because we've been told our input as the judge is really important. So I just accept that, and therefore make an effort to involve myself more in the process in the way that I'm being encouraged to do by the other professionals that are part of that court. You have to learn how to take your cues to a certain extent from the other workers. Is this someone who needs some encouragement, a little bit of a caution, or a very concrete warning? You know, so much comes from other people. And as a judge, you have to get used to accepting those comments and recommendations. What the judges do in my area locally is we have a bench book of judicial notes. They're confidential amongst the judges, and they just help us track what's happening for each person. Did someone's brother just die from an overdose? Did somebody just finally land a job, or they got a new dog, or whatever it might be? Even small things are important to building some rapport and maintaining a relationship with that person, because I'm told it's very important. Whether you're encouraging them, cautioning them, holding them accountable, helping to maybe shift a plan or tweak an activity, getting them to identify in a concrete way how their needs have changed or the things they're struggling with. So I find those kinds of notes are really, really helpful. And I think it means a lot to people in the court that you're aware of these issues and mindful of them, and trying to find a way to work with that person to move them along the path towards a good end result. You also have to keep in mind all the privacy issues. Many of them have been mentioned already. And at the end of the day, what that means for me anyway, and I think some of my colleagues, is you leave a full day in community court exhausted, because there are so many streams of thought you hold in your mind. It requires a huge amount of focus and energy coming from the bench, because it's a much more organic process each time. There isn't the usual structured steps that there would be in a conventional appearance. It's often a very wandering path. Patience and flexibility are the watchwords. Constantly redefining what success means for this particular person and checking in with them every step along the way. What is reasonably possible for this person? So, you know, creative, concrete, and keep trying. Every day's another day, and you might have to kind of start all over again or go off on a different track. But just for me, it's go with the flow based on the good advice that I'm getting from the other professionals.
You know, Justice Perkins-McVeigh, the next question I have is going to be for you. But before I get into it, I was going to ask you about the impact of the federal government coming up with a bill that was going to mandate diversion for simple possession offenses. But before you answer that question, just moving from what Justice Cameron said, you remember the story you told us about the participant who asked you whether you're having a bad day?
Yeah.
And yeah, if you could tell it. I mean, I thought I was moved by that.
So I just wanted to say that what Justice Cameron said is true. I find it is very hard to sit in drug treatment court because it's a bit like, as I said, it's a bit like you're a race car driver, and at some moments you're speeding around the track and you're rah-rah and you're really excited and you're so pleased for somebody and you're clapping hands, and the next minute somebody's not doing well and you have to change gears really quickly. And honesty is the hallmark of our drug treatment program. And I had a day in February, I probably wasn't alone. It was dark, it was snowing, I was tired of everything. I had too much on my plate. And somebody said, "And how are you doing?" And I said, "I have hit a wall. I am not doing so well today. I'm trying to give myself the talk I give myself and my daughters, and the talk I sometimes give you guys, but now I need to give the talk to myself." And I can tell you that day in drug treatment court, we had a fellow who had been lying to his counselor about his drug use. He had claimed that, he tested positive because of impassive ingestion. You know, I was near somebody that was smoking marijuana, or I had sex with a girl that had used cocaine. And when he came, that was the story he'd given his counselor, and I expected that would be the story in court. But when it came to his turn, he said, "Yeah, I've hit a wall too, and I'm not doing well, and I don't know how to get out of it. But I've been using marijuana because I'm anxious and I can't sleep at night, and I've been lying to my counselor for the last 2 weeks." And he said, you being honest with me about not doing so well or not having a perfect day, said to me that if you can be honest in the program, then so can I. And no, I'm not going to let out my innermost secrets, but I just felt that it was misleading if they felt that I always had a perfect day. So it's actually meant quite a lot, because we've talked back other weeks about that very thing. And the talk I gave myself about don't look at the mountain, just do one thing at a time. And so one of the fellows today, because I was sitting in drug treatment court this afternoon, he said, "I had to give myself the talk about the mountain, but Your Honor, it worked." I said, "I know. So how was your week?" And he said, "I bought a plant." I said, "Fantastic." And he goes, "I'm really happy because I watch my plant grow every day." I said, "Well, they don't grow that fast." But anyway, we had a great talk, and it's really helped us to form some bonds in our drug treatment court. So I think honesty on all sides is what it's about. But at the same time, it is a court. And for example, we had a guy that for some reason didn't show up today. So now I said, I'm going to issue a bench warrant with discretion and try to find him and have him brought in front of me today. So there's those two horses you have to ride all the time. But I really agree with all of your other comments, Justice Cameron.
It's a very human-centered approach, isn't it? You know, it's like you're building relationships with these people. You're trying to identify their strengths and really garner those strengths, because I believe everybody's got gifts and talents. Everybody's got problems, but everybody's got gifts and talents. And so one of the things we do is we've got that wall of hope that we have in the courtroom, and that folks who are artistic decide, that they want to paint something or do a drawing, or they're not forced to, but often they'll come in and they'll present it to the court, and they're just so proud of what they've done, and we make a big deal of it. And those are small accomplishments. And you're right, there are days where I feel sorry for myself, and then I go into court and these folks have it so much worse than I do, and I think I have nothing to complain about. Nothing.
I know, but part of what it is I don't really focus on their addiction. I allow the counselors to focus on the addiction. I want to help build their self-respect. I want to build them up as people. I want to get them to know them as people. We too keep notes, whether it's their dog, the names of their kids, whether their mother died, what color they liked. The day I first noticed somebody totally transformed, like you can often visually see somebody transform. Or today, the fellow that bought the plant, you could just hear, it's a ficus plant, and he was telling me about how he'd learned how you can take care of it. You could just hear the joy in his voice. And I had prefaced it by saying, I've moved all my plants into the sun so that they can get a little taste of summer today. And he said, oh, I'm going to go do the same as soon as court's over. And anyway, that kind of thing is getting to know them as people and building up their self-respect. I often go to lunch with them. We're back in the olden days, pre-COVID, I would go to lunch. And I know one fellow said, I can't believe I'm sitting beside a judge. I said, well, I'm just about to have my Caesar salad. Why don't you have yours too? Like, I don't know if he thought I didn't eat or what, but that kind of treating them as people is really what makes the difference in whatever specialized court you sit in. Sorry, we digress.
No, it's all right. So you can see that this is very rewarding work. And the reason why it's rewarding work is that I've always said when we help others, we really help ourselves. You get a certain satisfaction that is special. So Justice Cameron, what are some of the challenges and benefits of working in a specialized court?
Well, I think we've just been talking about a lot of those. Probably for me, there's sort of two main challenges. One is energy, because you need a lot of it and focus to do that court properly. And the other one is that balancing act between letting the therapeutic court run its own process, in a sense, to do what it needs to do for that particular person, and keeping it on track from a bigger perspective, which is it is still a court process. And sometimes we get a little bit caught up in the therapy, if I can put it that way, and forget, oh, wait a minute. This is a case that in conventional court would have been over and done within 6 months. And here we are at the 6-month mark, and we're all acting like it's going to go on for 3 more months or 6 more months or what. You have to keep that timeline in mind. I don't think being in those courts should, mean that someone has far more onerous responsibilities or timelines than the conventional process. And, you need to make sure that the victim voice is not lost with all the focus on rehabilitation, that the legal issues are not forgotten either in situations where they are important. Hopefully counsel has taken care of that, but many of our people don't have counsel. They're relying on duty counsel who may not have the whole picture. So it's that balancing act is not always easy. But, in an ideal world, wouldn't every accused person be in community court? Because almost every one of them has an issue, right? Don't we all? And addressing those issues is what brings out, as Chief Justice Williams said, the humanity in the process. And it is meant to be a human process. And the conventional court often has very little time for that, sadly. So that's one of the joys of working in there. It personally, emotionally, it can be much more difficult, but it can be much more rewarding. And everyone can walk away feeling that today we made the world just a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, we need to sort of get it to some, I see lots of questions. And I was just going to ask very quickly, you know, these courts have been around for at least more than 20 years. I don't want to age myself, but I was one of the people who started the very first one. Should there be like some kind of framework for this thing, a provincial framework or some type of framework to guide? Chief Justice, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, well, in Nova Scotia, we have the benefit of being small enough, but large enough to be able to tackle that kind of a program. So, you know, we've heard previously of mental health courts and drug treatment courts just popping up ad hoc with different purposes. In order to get buy-in for partnership with community services, with the Department of Health, Department of Justice, community agencies, we needed to bring everyone together, and in particular the Department of Health, and assure them that we wanted to develop alongside them some best practices and a framework for policies and protocols. There are going to be regional variations wherever you go. There may be needs for certain types of courts, more so in some areas than others. But we developed in Nova Scotia a provincial court working group, 45 people on it, from justice, health, community services, academia, First Voice, you name it. I'm a big proponent of collaboration and cooperation. And, you know, if you organize it and structure it well, it will work. And now we have a steering committee that is implementing some of these policies that we came up with. Who's my co-chair? Dr. Robert Strang, our chief medical officer, because he had been the person in charge of the opioid initiative here in Nova Scotia a number of years ago. And so right now we're building a strategic plan that we want to get out to government and others to try and sustain what we've got and enhance our programming. So there are 4 pillars to this strategic plan. One is communication, collaboration, and consultation. The second is strategic partnerships and relationships. The third is sustainability. And the fourth, of course, is the program enhancement and expansion. And so we've got a small group looking at a business case that we're going to present to key players with a comms plan with, you know, 2 communication officers, one from the judiciary and one from health, to try and help get the word out there. So like I said, we're small enough but large enough that we can do that on a provincial level. We don't have a committee like you do there in Ontario, but I think that a provincial framework for development and operations is going to move us forward.
Well, Heather, Lisa, Pam, Your Honors, it's been fun chatting with you. I've had a great time talking to you guys. It's been absolutely fun. Christine, I'm sure we've got some questions that we can at least try and answer 1 or 2. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Justice Barnes. Yes, we have a few questions here. The first one, how have the panel of judges been handling the request to use prescribed psychoactive substances, such as cannabis and benzodiazepines, in their circuits during treatment?
I can start by saying that we have a huge problem. Young males in particular between 18 and 25 who are using cannabis in large quantities on a daily basis, which is leading to psychosis. And so if they've got a major mental health disorder, which is impacted by the use of cannabis, we try to work really hard with the healthcare professionals that they've got linked with in the community to educate them and to persuade them that continued use is only going to exacerbate their symptoms and their illness.
Thank you.
The other aspect is our treatment provider, although the prevailing view is that cannabis is legal and as long as it's not problematic use, they should be able to. I know some, that's a current trend in addiction treatment, but our treatment provider has explained to us very clearly how cannabis is often a gateway to use of other drugs and that the use of cannabis still clouds their thinking, leads to impulsivity, and as Justice Williams indicated, is very problematic. And we have maintained that we'll work with people over a long period of time to stop their use of cannabis, but we really feel that they can't be using cannabis in a in our abstinent-based program. There may be other programs where it can be managed on a problematic use basis with referral to health professionals, but it is certainly, it adds to the complexity of dealing with persons with addiction.
Having said that, if it doesn't lead to a psychosis, we have a harm reduction model. So I can think of a street person heavily addicted to cocaine, who was able to get off the cocaine and is maintained on marijuana. That is a success.
I agree with you entirely. That's what I'm saying, is that it's problematic. But if you've got an abstinence-based program, then it won't work. But there are other programs where, as you say, it's a victory to use the harm reduction model, and to move from heroin to cannabis is a victory.
Yeah.
And then managed opiate programs are very successful for some people. And I suggest to those that can't work in drug treatment court, try the managed opiate program, go to the harm reduction program.
Thank you, Justice. Another question here, is there any thought to considering expanding the drug treatment courts to include alcohol addiction treatment?
Well, we had that issue in Nova Scotia. Alcohol is a huge, huge problem. And so on a very pilot basis, we determined very recently to have an alcohol court program. In the beginning, we said no to alcohol because we were afraid that the floodgates was just going to consume us completely. But more recently, we're looking at the hardcore alcoholics who engage in residential treatment and trying to work with them.
That's fantastic. Thank you. What plan is there, if any, to apply the Gladue court model to Black youth within the court system, with the understanding that their experiences are somewhat similar to the Indigenous population?
Okay, well, I'll answer that. Unless somebody wants to answer it.
No, go ahead, Justice Barnes.
Okay. There are a couple of things. The first thing that the Gladue principles certainly are applied. They should be technically they should be applied. I simply wrote a decision recently that was released where I more or less made that argument that this doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any sense to have that differentiation. Understanding that people have different historical reasons for discrimination. Right? There's a whole different, they're not the same. But I just wrote a decision where I said discrimination is discrimination. It causes stress on everybody. It causes mental health illness, all kinds of stuff. And so we should be moving towards in that regard. So I think we'll get there eventually. The thing is that Gladue came from a specific legislation in the criminal code, which specifically referred to Aboriginal persons. And some of us have been trying to say that we can expand it beyond that, and we just have to see how the law develops. But the law is going to develop.
Well, of course, Morris is being decided in the Court of Appeal as we speak. And in addition, I'm releasing a decision tomorrow also on a very similar topic, Justice Barnes. And I too am finding that cultural assessments and cultural-based reports are so helpful in helping me better understand how to really sentence some of the very disadvantaged persons of color that come before me, and the overrepresentation of particularly young Black males in our prison system. And it's difficult to wrestle with because often the charges are very serious, and like Gladue, it's harder to apply the principle of restraint and rehabilitation when the charges are serious. But I think that it's something that we as a community really need to think about. And I think that it can be applicable to many different groups that are so disadvantaged in our communities. And I agree, it should be the way that we deal with sentencing of all offenders. And we shouldn't be pigeonholing people that way. But at present, that's how it works. But I know as a judge that I sentence differently because I sit in the rehabilitative courts, and I look for different information. And I hope that I can apply the principle of restraint in some measured way with the focus of rehabilitation.
Thank you for sharing. I think that's all the time we have for questions. We'll try to answer a few here, or perhaps people with questions can reach out directly to the panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you to this amazing group of judges for joining us today and sharing your experiences and best practices for specialized courts across Ontario and in Nova Scotia. This marks the end of day one of the Provincial HSJCC Specialized Courts Forum. We'd like to thank all of our special guests and keynote speakers for their valuable insights today. To our attendees, we thoroughly hope that you've enjoyed today's sessions and look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow for an exciting second day. I would like to remind everyone that part 2 will begin at 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. Please use your confirmed registration link to join the platform. I would now like to turn it over to Little Brown Bear to provide us with some closing thoughts.
Quay. I want to say Niawe, Marcy, and Chimigwich for all of those words that were shared today, and those words of encouragement, and as we move forward with one another, that we continue the dialogue. I know sometimes it's very difficult doing what we do, but you know, we don't do this for glory or fame. We do this because people are in pain. And as we continue to walk together, we can help each other. As we walk arm in arm, we can help each other. And that I know that we recognize that the system is broke, and that we need to take those steps to help rebuild that system, to help those people that come before us, to provide them the tools, the problem-solving strategies, the coping skills that they need for themselves, to help themselves, and then to help heal their families and their communities, and then hopefully eventually the nation. You know, one of the things that is quite clear is that sometimes, you know, we think the culture is too big to change. And I think we forget that we're the culture that we need to change in order to help individuals along that journey. So I will leave you with a few words. But first, I want to thank the spirits from the east and the spirits from the south, the spirits from the west and the spirits from the north that came to help us today, to sit with us today, that we were able to listen to one another today. I want to thank le grand-père le ciel, la grand-mère la lune, notre frère le soleil, notre mère la terre, our Mother Earth and our ancestors. And I'll leave you with these words of my philosophy, is that people don't care how much you know, but they want to know how much you care. And if we can show that, a lot more individuals will get the help that they need. So it's a great honor to be here to do the close. Everyone have a restful evening, an evening of reflection, and be safe. And we will see everybody tomorrow. Chimigwich, Niawagoa, Marcy, merci.
Thank you.